Welcome again, and we get to hear some more writers read. And I love that we get to connect their words with the sound of their voice. And it's such an important connection, and that's part of what makes this evening program so delightful. I was thinking more and more about the year that I taught 8th grade English. I had 8th grade English in the morning and kindergarten in the afternoon, and the superintendent said, "Nancy, you can do this. They have the same attention span." But that was the year that I worked with writers, real writers in the 8th grade, and it was a good, rich experience for me. I had a gifted student who renamed 8th grade English into Coping with Cope. I said, "Roger, it's good I have a sense of humor." So today we're hearing Anne Brand and Paul Niebanck, and we'll start with Paul's perfect poem. Here we go. I say a line, you say a line. Right, right, right.
Right, right, right.
Until you get it right.
Until you get it right.
Then read aloud.
And read aloud.
You'll draw a crowd.
You'll draw a crowd.
And bring us great delight.
And bring us great delight.
And here is the poet, Paul Niebanck. Poet Paul Niebanck, tell us a little bit about your writing process. What might we learn from you?
Well, it so happens that you gave us some tips on email, and I want to remark on those and maybe pick out one to speak about. When do you write? When you get stuck, what do you do then? Do you have a muse? Do you use a device, or do you write with pencil or pen and paper? What do you do when you lose track of time? I like all of these questions, and as those who know me best know, I could expound on anything, anytime, including these wonderful questions. I read them because they're so good, and it's fine for the audience, most of whom are writers or wannabe writers or folks interested in writing, to hear. Now, which one? Well, the middle one. Do I have a muse? No, I don't have a muse. And then again, yes, I do have a muse. When I write, I'm likely to have done some free writing. I do that in the morning when I do it. It's a good thing to do. And I am likely to come upon somebody or some instance which is of interest to me, something I love, something from my deep memory that I hadn't thought of for a long, long time. And I write about that, and I see how it goes with pencil and paper. And then as I move along, if something develops, then I go to the word processor and continue, and then eventually turn something out or not. And if I do, then I spend time editing it. And I do that in the morning. I'm a morning person, so that's when my writing starts. So that may help a little. I think the questions are more important than my particular answer.
Well, thank you, Paul.
Indeed.
Thank you very much. I like your suggestion of free writing, because that sometimes does stir a memory or an idea.
Exactly.
I might resume that free writing habit.
Yep.
So thank you, Paul.
Indeed. All right. I have two small pieces. That's what I call them. They're not exactly stories. I call them pieces that came from that very process. That is, I was free writing, doing morning pages is what I call them. on a given morning, probably 5, 8 years ago. And that's when I started to write in a creative way. And these came upon me and insisted that I write about them. The first is an encounter I had at a certain point, which you'll hear. That encounter turned out to be an instant kind of love story, and then it went the way of all things. So that's how I see this particular story. It's called Fathers and Sons. I'm feeling just fine. I'm flying east, SeaTac to Newark, to be with my son Paul, then to take in 2 weeks of peace and relaxation at the Holy Cross Monastery. As for the monastery, it's on the west bank of the Hudson River, 40 miles north of New York City, opposite the Roosevelt Estate. It's operated by an Episcopal Benedictine order that practices silence and simplicity. I've been there once before, so I'm familiar with how the experience will unfold. As for Paul, he's been graduated from the Yale School of Drama, and he's well into his career as an actor. That's the career that claimed him a decade prior to Yale. Paul will be married to Jess next month, and I've got a surprise for him, for her, for them. I have an aisle seat in the coach section of a Boeing 737. The weather promises to provide us a smooth, non-stop flight. I take out my book, Flannery O'Connor, Wise Blood. On other occasions, it might have been Ursula Le Guin, or Jack London, or some other classic. It has to be a classic. Flying tends to be an unnerving experience for me, and I've learned that good literature is the best antidote. My surprise for Paul is zipped into my jacket pocket. I pat the pocket to be sure it's there, then settle into my reading. Paul and I will be together tonight for dinner. He wants to show me an Indian restaurant that has become a favorite of his and Jess's. Tomorrow I'll be on the train to Holy Cross. Then, back in the city, Paul and I expect to take a stroll in Central Park, then to have tea before my return flight. At tea, I'll present him with the engagement ring that my father gave to my mother. It's a simple ring of white gold, inset with 2 square diamonds and several smaller ones. Before she died, Mother laid the ring in Linda's palm in the hopes that Linda or I would lay it in Paul's for his fiancée. I imagine now that when I ask Paul to close his eyes and accept the ring, his eyes will moisten with joy. My eyes will moisten too. The man in the middle seat is unusually quiet, and his body is impressively still. I don't even notice him until a quarter of the way into our flight. He occupies his time with spells of typing and napping. When he is awake, his fingers alternate from active and engaged to folded and relaxed. I am fascinated with his hands. Relatively small, proportionate with the compactness of his body, they are smooth, muscular, and well-groomed. His fingers fly, and his touch is light, sure, efficient. This fellow's evident focus and discipline and absorption and grace grow on me during our flight, and I feel increasingly comfortable with him. I smile to realize that my own pattern of reading and resting has fallen into sync with his. It's almost as though we were becoming friends. Now there's an hour before the plane descends. The man wakes from his fourth or fifth nap, closes his laptop, and folds his hands. May I engage you a bit, I ask. I've noticed something that I'd like to share. He looks at me directly and he smiles. We shake hands and exchange first names, John and Paul. The strength of our handshake confirms my right to speak. I have been admiring your hands, I say. They could be the hands of a master needleworker, or a surgeon, or a sculptor. John is quick to respond. You have something there, although I never thought of it that way. I was a catcher all the way through high school, college, and into the minor leagues. Now I'm a doctor, a dermatologist. I played in AAA. My batting average wasn't good enough to get me to the majors, but nobody ever faulted my catching. Well, I say, a good catcher will need to have quick fingers for sure. Maybe as quick as the pitcher he would be catching. Strong hands too, and quick wrists. Yes, and it's rather nice of you to notice. Thank you for your interest. John tells me more about what catching requires and how much he enjoyed it. I tell John what I'll be doing in the East, what the experience at Holy Cross will entail. I envy you, he says. I enjoy simple pleasures too, and maybe meditation will become one of them. Seattle is a place full of ambitious people. I confess that I'm one of them. But I've found a balance. I do sea kayaking, alone and with a lifetime friend. I enjoy the peace and quiet of Puget Sound. For now, anyway, that's my equivalent of meditation. I tell John a bit about the monastery, the monks' general rule, which is silence, and their vocation, which is hospitality. Then I pull from my pocket the secret I've been carrying. I tell John about the ups and downs of Paul's career as an actor, and of the passion I have for him as my child and as my friend. John laughs softly, as though he has a secret of his own. As our plane begins to descend, I ask, so what's your destination? I'm here to attend the Mets-Braves game. My son plays first base for the Mets. I'll fly back home tomorrow. I can't contain myself. John Olerud. He's one of my favorite players, Gold Glove fielder. Talk about quick hands and a great eye at the plate. He reminds me of the Yankees star Hank Bauer, man of the hour, they used to call him. And Jay Buhner, too. You could count on these guys to hit in the clutch. The same is true with your son. I can't fathom why the Mariners would trade him away. We're on the tarmac now, and we're both laughing. Somber travelers sitting near us have picked up our delight, and they're laughing along. I'll be thinking about John as a junior from now on, I say. Have a good time with him, and here's to his success in tonight's game. Thanks. And enjoy your rendezvous with your son, Paul. He's a junior, right? Well, right. We walk together to the baggage claim area, and I see John Sr. to his cab. Say, you must have played in the Pacific Coast League Seattle team. You got it. Next day, I pick up a copy of the New York Times at Grand Central Terminal. As my train moves slowly up the Hudson, I take my eyes off the autumn colors and open the paper to the sports section. Last night's game was Game 4 of the National League Championship Series. In the bottom of the 8th, John Olerud Jr. hit a single off John Rocker of the Braves. His hit scored what proved to be the tying and winning runs. Okay. The next one also has a wonderful, surprising connection, and it too is a love story. I think most of my stories end up being instant love stories, and then they're gone. Each of these are true stories, and they happened in the 10 years or so before Linda and I moved to Horizon House, so they're still very fresh in my own memory and my heart. This one is called Gift of Time. When springtime in Seattle finally comes out from under the winter blanket of fog and drizzle, its smile is bright and its mood is balmy. That's the kind of day it is. It's a Sunday in May, shortly after Easter, when I come out of church and find myself striding down the hill. From 5th and Marion, I do a diagonal, and the light weekend traffic gives me the right of way. 4th and Columbia, 3rd and Cherry, 2nd and James, 1st and Yesler. From there, it'll be a straight shot, 3 blocks south past Elliott Bay. Books. Mike will be there at the corner selling real change, and I'll be home. I'm on the sunny side of Yesler when a young man crosses from the shady side and approaches me. Sir, have you got a minute? Living in Pioneer Square has taught me to be prepared for such occasions, and I'm ready. I keep my wad of bills in my left front trousers pocket, the small ones on top, so that if the impulse hits me, I can whisk out a single or two, exchange a greeting, hand the money over, and move on. This time I do feel the impulse, but what I pull out is not a 1, but a 20. I must have run out of 1s and 5s yesterday. Okay, once a bill is out, it's mighty hard to put it back, and I have no mind to do so anyway. What flashes through my brain as I transfer the cash, this ought to help, is the memory of a similar moment maybe 10 years previous, when, having just arrived at the subway platform underneath Penn Station in New York City, I notice a group of young people sitting on the platform floor. One of them notices me too, and suddenly an attractive girl is in my face. I pull out a bill, and just as now, it's a 20. The honey is out of the bottle. The girl throws her arms around my neck and gives me a kiss to last a lifetime. Right smack on my smacker. Back to the present. My hope is that this fellow won't offer me a kiss. He doesn't. He goes that young lady one better. He accepts my $20 bill and exclaims, "Great! Now I can go play pool." The young man's frankness and delight bowl me over. Hesitantly I respond, "Do you mean it?" "Sure," the man says. "Okay. You know, Temple Billiards is just down the street. It happens to be on a block this side of where I live." "I've seen it, but I've never been inside." "Well, how about this? We go together, we play 3 games of 8-ball, that's the only game I know, and then I pay and you keep the 20. "It's a deal." He sticks out his hand. "I'm Sam." We shake hands. "And I'm Paul." Linda will be expecting me home, so I give her a heads up on my phone, and off we go. The temple is already open. On the street level is a counter with snacks, also a few board games, and 4 pool tables. Down in the basement, there are 7 pool tables and a billiards table. It's usually quiet down there, as though out of respect for the game. 2 of the tables are active upstairs, and I propose that we go down. We're the only ones there. We get right to it. We flip for break. Sam breaks. The balls scatter widely, but nothing goes in. Then, for the first time ever, I run 7 balls. Sam misses, and I sink the 8-ball. Game over. The second game goes much slower. I've got stripes. Sam's got solids. I'm ahead at first, but Sam comes on and I find myself chasing the 11-ball all around the table. Sam sinks the 8-ball, a carom shot into the side pocket. But wait, there goes the cue ball crawling toward the corner pocket. Plop. Sam has scratched. I win again. Sam laughs. We both laugh. Sam's voice reveals a southern accent. Turns out he's from East Tennessee. I used to work in that vicinity when I was young and footloose. We compare memories. But we're there to play pool, and we get back to it. Loser breaks, that's Sam, and he sinks 2 balls. Then he misses an impossible shot. I sink 1, but then I miss an oh no shot. One that a raw beginner would have made. Sam suddenly straightens up. His countenance changes, and he breathes deeply. Something tells me that the curtain is about to come down. My feeling is right on target. Sam takes over. Anticipating the worst, I retire to a high stool and watch Sam sink all 5 of his remaining balls, 3 of them requiring the kind of expertise that you would only see on television. One of them is a 3-cushion shot. I'm dazzled. My head can't stop shaking. Then the 8-ball is a direct shot, and in it goes. Sam and I look at each other. Smiles pop out on both our faces. You're a hustler, I quip. Nah, I was just lucky. We laugh again. We've both been lucky, I say. We high-five. Then I take the tray of balls and turn to climb the stairs. I notice as I ascend that downstairs a middle-aged man has begun to play by himself. I wonder, will Sam hang around and maybe play him? Is Sam really a hustler? Maybe the other man is a hustler. I hand in the balls and play what's due. And as I go to leave, I see Sam has followed me up the stairs. He looks at me again, the way he looked at me back there on Yesler Street. I wink. Thanks for the lesson, Sam, and thanks for the memory. Thank you, Paul, he says. Thanks for the 20. Thanks for the games. Thanks for the competition. I step toward the doors, sensing that Sam has still not moved. I turn around. And sir, he says, thanks for your time.
Oh, very nice. Oh, what a gift. You took us right with you on both those experiences.
How fine.
Thank you so much.
Indeed.
Just a gift to us. Oh my. Okay, now we get to hear Anne Brand, and we'll hear what her writing process might include, or a little hint she can give us. Hi, Anne.
Hello.
Good to see you.
Thank you.
So glad you're reading. So glad.
It'll be an adventure.
It will be an adventure. That's good. Okay. Well, Anne, what do you think you can tell us about your writing process?
Well, I liked your questions too.
Okay.
And the one that I've been thinking a lot about has been, what do I do when I'm stuck? Because I'm stuck often. And when I first started trying to put pen to paper here at Horizon House, I didn't know how to get started. And I was looking at a family photograph album and thought, oh, wow, I have things to say about these people in this album. Maybe I could start here. And that really did open up for me, just getting into the process itself. When I get stuck now, I kind of stay stuck for a long time. But I'm beginning to come out of that.
Good.
And look forward to maybe getting more disciplined.
Yeah, see, that's what it is, Anne, and I'm moving that direction, I hope.
Oh, good.
More self-discipline. So, let's hear your story today.
What I'm going to read today are excerpts from an account of my being a pilot, how I became one, and one or two episodes of that learning process, which turns out is lifelong and is a metaphor for all kinds of learning in my life.
Wonderful.
So I'm going to start with what I call Let's Go Fly. It was late spring. The afternoon was light and was soft with no sharp edges or deep contrasts. Classes were over for the day. I walked down the steps of France Hall, wondering what to do. What would satisfy my itch for freedom from homework, even for a while, on this promising spring day? I began walking for the bus home. One of the few other female graduate students in the department asked if she could give me a lift home. Prospects for the afternoon began looking up. Dee drove a Jaguar XK150, and she was able to park on campus, a perk that I assumed came with her research assistantship. As we headed through Westwood Village, Dee asked me whether I would like to go flying. Now, I did not know Dee well. In fact, this was our first time being together as two and not part of a group. She was in the third year of her program and I was in my first year. We had no classes together. She was specializing in developmental psychology and I was as yet undecided about any specialization. So when she asked me to go flying, my immediate conclusion was that this was a metaphorical question. It never occurred to me to take her literally. Needing a break, I thought whatever diversion she had in mind was worth exploring. So I said, sure. Okay, she said, we'll be at the airport in about 20 minutes. Still did not sink in that we were actually going to go flying in an airplane. However, when we pulled into the parking space next to Santa Monica Flyers, adjacent to the taxiway of the single runway Santa Monica Airport, it started to sink in that Dee really meant we were actually going to fly. My next assumption was that someone would take us up. Wrong again. Dee and I exited her car and she suggested I wait for a few minutes while she went inside. She came back out with a clipboard and gestured for me to accompany her toward a line of exceedingly small, single-engine aircraft. She pointed to one and said, "This one's ours." I was looking at a Cessna 150. It was one of several with identical yellow and blue paint jobs, but each with a unique number painted on its side. I also learned later the horsepower of this single-engine, two-place aircraft was only a tad more powerful than the engine of my vintage VW Beetle. By this time, I was both fascinated and anxious about what I had embarked upon. I watched as Dee performed a walk-around of the plane, checking its control surfaces, all moving parts, oil and fuel levels, and general airworthiness. She completed the process and said, "Time to get in," directing me to the right side of the airplane. So I got in. She got in, and I noticed we were in tight quarters. I buckled the seatbelt, latched the door, and started paying attention to Dee's actions. I was intrigued with how easily she executed the motions of starting up the engine, engaging the radio communication system, calling for taxi clearance, and then applying power to start us taxiing toward the active runway. She was wearing a headset, and I heard only her side of the communication with ground control in the tower. A lot of what she said were numbers which had no meaning to me, but her chatter also included requests and repeated clearances. Once we reached the area where pilots run through some engine tests in readiness for takeoff, my stomach started to churn. When airborne, I was not going to be able to ask Dee to pull over and let me out. And by the time that thought sank in, we were taxiing out for takeoff. The roar of full power to that engine was ludicrously stingy to my ears. Nevertheless, we gathered speed and were shortly aloft, the ground dropping away below us. We climbed straight out toward the coast. I got a magnificent view of the Pacific Ocean spreading out beyond the shores of Santa Monica and other beach cities. We flew up the coast toward Malibu, gaining altitude as we went. I had no idea what Dee's plan was for that flight, and I didn't care. We were flying. Dee put the plane through some gentle maneuvers in what she later described as a typical introductory flight. Our return to the airport came too soon, but I was absorbed in the precision of the approach and landing. We taxied back to the flight school. My legs were just a little wobbly as we pushed the plane into its parking spot. We went into the office of Santa Monica Flyers, where Dee turned in the flight log. She introduced me to Chuck Miller, who owned and operated Santa Monica Flyers. Dee said, "I think we've got a prospect here." "Great," he replied. "I can help with that," as he reached for the forms to sign me up as a student pilot. Whoa, this was moving way too fast. I came down off my pink cloud. Voices in my head were saying things like, "I can't possibly afford this, women don't fly, going for a joyride is one thing, becoming a pilot? I don't think so." But oh, I thought, what if I could? What if I could be a pilot myself, able to strap out an airplane and fire it up and fly? I needed to talk to Dee. Over coffee together in the lounge area of the flight school, I asked, "Why did you learn to fly? Why are you still flying? Do you fly alone? How much did it cost to get your pilot's license?" The most intriguing information that I remember from that conversation was that Dee was working on her commercial rating so that she would qualify to fly as pilot in command in the annual all-woman transcontinental air race. I concluded that a private pilot rating was just the first step, and that one could continue to expand proficiency in the air and earn advanced ratings. I went back and spoke to Chuck. He gave me some printouts detailing time, costs, and the steps toward a private pilot license: ground school, in-flight instruction, solo flying, and then passing the private pilot exam. Well, I knew enough about learning complex tasks that the gains from one lesson to the next depended in no small degree on the frequency of lessons. It was clear that on my predoctoral fellowship income, I could not afford to fly for 3 times a week and still pay rent and eat. Well, Chuck said, you could use credit and do it that way. Little did he know that he was talking to a woman who didn't have a credit card and by nature was averse to the very idea. Nor did I have the kind of job or any other attribute that would qualify me for establishing credit. What was I to do? Not sure, but I was hooked on the idea of flying. If other women could do it, maybe I could too. I knew that students were able to obtain and use credit cards if their parents or some other acceptable party guaranteed payment of any charges made on the card. Aha. Although I had been more or less on my own for about 6 years, occasionally during those years I had called on my mother for support. She had never turned me down. I went to the well again, explaining why I wanted a credit card, how much I thought the process of getting my license would take, and how I would pay her back. In retrospect, I suspect that Mother decided before she agreed to this scheme that she would never accept payback. She had a calculus all her own for rationalizing gifts like this one, which I simply never questioned nor understood until much, much later. And as a rebel herself, who in her own way challenged the limitations imposed by societal expectations for the roles acceptable for women, she was drawn to my fervent desire to fly. In any event, she agreed, and I was off and flying. I managed to fit in the ground school hours and the flight time with commitments to classes in my fellowship. I started lessons in July 1961, and that was just the beginning. Next, I'm going to introduce you to my flight instructor, Jim and 139er Sierra Foxtrot. The first choice I had to make was to decide on a flight instructor. I asked Dee for her opinion. She told me that as far as she was concerned, there were 2 instructors at Santa Monica, Florida she could recommend. She said they were very different. One was a young guy who was using his certified flight instructor rating from the FAA as a way to build his flight time toward an airline transport rating. The second was an ex-crop duster and Navy pilot. The first had an easygoing style of teaching. He was patient, not pushy, and he was very competent. The second was a tough, slightly crusty, middle-aged guy known to be uncompromising and demanding. He also was known to lose students because of his attitude. However, the owners at Santa Monica Flyers kept him on because the students who stuck with him didn't fail their check rides, enhancing the reputation of the school. I chose Jim, the crusty ex-crop duster. He was a short man, about 5'7". My guess is that before he was badly injured in an auto accident, he was taller. He had a severe limp. His right wrist did not bend. The fingers of his right hand were permanently straightened, and his nose had never been treated cosmetically after being badly broken. I'm sorry I do not have a picture of him, but I am not sure any photo I could have taken would capture the defiance of the man. That attitude, and what I learned over time of his certainty that there was no emergency he would encounter in flight that he could not walk away from, were intoxicating to me. When we started out, he said he would be happy to fly with me after I passed the ground school course for private pilots, which was part of the package I had paid for. He did not want to waste his time and his students' money before the student had learned the rudiments of flight, mechanics, weather, navigation, radio procedures. This was the first example of his not playing by the rules of his employer. The flight school preferred instructors to begin flight training right away to keep the students' interest high while going through ground school. I learned more about Jim's dancing to his own tune as my flight training progressed. I attended the evening ground school classes with other pilots in training, There were no other women in the class of about 8. I seldom offered comments or answered questions in class. What I remember is observing that we covered every topic only as thoroughly as necessary in order to pass the exam. And I was acutely aware that there was a whole lot more that I needed to know before I felt proficient. But I completed the course and passed the exam, and then I scheduled my first lesson on July 21, 1961. I arrived that day full of trepidation. Jim greeted me and walked me through the procedures of selecting an aircraft from among the 6 or 7 Cessna 150s available. He had scheduled his favorite, 139SF, and told me that from then on I would be responsible for scheduling the plane. He directed me to get the clipboard for the plane, and we proceeded to the pre-flight check. I thought I had memorized the process, but under his scrutiny it became clear that while I could spout it back on paper or verbally, performing these simple tasks under his critical eye brought out all the fluster I was capable of showing. Egad, I thought, if I can't even do this right, what in the world makes me think I can fly? Once in the plane, Jim handled the radio communication and told me just to follow the instructions we received. When we were cleared to taxi to the active runway, I began to gently advance the throttle. Jim put his hand over mine and gave the throttle a firm push. He said I should just follow him through by lightly holding the controls, resting my feet lightly on the rudder pedals, and listening to the instructions from ground control. He taxied to the run-up area, and I followed him through the pre-flight engine and control checks. And then he switched us to the tower frequency and asked for takeoff clearance. I had memorized the words used to communicate letters and numbers, but when the tower said, 39ers here, Foxtrot cleared for takeoff, it did not register. Oh well, Jim wasted no time in getting onto the runway, giving full throttle to this little engine that could, and once again I was flying. We flew for an hour. Once we had cleared the control zone around the airport, Jim said, "It's your airplane." Lingo, of course, for his telling me I was in control. I looked at him and said, "Oh, what do I do?" "Just keep this rate of climb and course," he replied. I discovered I didn't really have to do anything in order to follow that instruction. And as I look back on that first lesson, it was all about how little control you have to exert when flying in smooth air. I followed him through the basic maneuvers like climbing, gliding, and turns, so focused I didn't realize when he was no longer touching the controls as I responded to his directions. No sooner had my confidence begun to build than it was time to head back to the airport. I realized that this would be the hard part. I had to be alert to all other traffic in the air, remain very attentive to the chatter from the control tower, and be able to recognize my aircraft's call signs that were broadcast along with all the other call signs I heard. The tower operators seemed to be talking gibberish. As I listened to Jim doing it, I heard the banter he introduced and thought, oh wow, he not only comprehends the messages, he enjoys the exchanges. Once in the landing pattern and given clearance to land, I followed Jim through as he executed a perfect power-off landing. I want to be able to do that. Will I ever? Solo. Flying in summer was best early in the morning. The air over the Los Angeles basin was generally soft and clear. Seldom was there any wind to push Cessna 139ers Sierra Foxtrot around. Air traffic at the airport was practically non-existent. Early on a weekday morning, unlike weekends when you could end up with the traffic pattern and hearing Niners, Seth, you are number 14 to land. The morning of Monday, August 21, 1961, was beautiful and perfect for me. I had progressed through basic maneuvers to stalls, slow flights, steep turns, takeoffs and landings, even with a moderate crosswind. By this time, I had put together 10.5 hours of flight time. This particular morning, I arrived at Santa Monica Airport just before 8, feeling competent to undertake whatever Jim was ready to throw at me. I had such confidence in him that as long as he was in the right seat, I would try whatever he asked of me. I went through the usual pre-flight routine, which Jim called kick the tires and light the fires, while he sipped his coffee looking pretty cleary-eyed. We got into the airplane, received taxi clearance, and taxied out to the run-up area. After run-up checks, we switched to the tower frequency. Jim told me to request permission to remain in the pattern to practice touch and goes. We received clearance and began our takeoff roll down the runway. That moment, when the wing starts to fly, is magical. The vibration from the wheels on the runway drops away, the horizon slowly expands, and with realization of flight is a visceral awareness of vulnerability, trust, and my responsibility to straighten up and fly it right. Even today, on a commercial flight, I pause to remember those feelings. But back then, those feelings meant, okay, now is now. Everything else dropped away just as did terra firma. I was completely focused on the present in a way I never felt at any other time. We were climbing up to 1,000 feet, pattern altitude, and I turned onto the crosswind leg of the pattern, then downwind. Jim was fanatic about altitude control, and I was being very careful about it. He had been drilling me about how to judge when it was time to turn onto the base leg and then onto final approach. Jim would not allow me to rely on power from the airplane to time and manage my approaches. Once you pull the power and establish your glide, you have made the decision that you are where you need to be to get the bird down without relying on adding power to correct your judgment. Of course, I made many errors, gaining the experience necessary to accomplish this with any consistency. But that was the goal. This beautiful summer morning, all went well. We completed about 4 trips around the patch when Jim told me to make a full stop landing. I did. We taxied off the runway, and then he told me to contact ground control for clearance to taxi to the base of the control tower. We'd never done that before. I assumed he wanted to chat with the controllers about something. We got to the tower, and I started to shut the power off when Jim said, "Keep it running. It's time for your solo. I want to see just one takeoff and full stop landing. Then taxi back here and pick me up." Before this really registered, he was out the door and walking toward the tower. Well, I went into a state of hyperdrive. From today's vantage point, it felt much like other experiences I've had when all the discretionary choices leading up to this point had been made. And now, whatever is about to unfold is inevitable. Not unlike arriving for a final exam, starting into labor with my babies, signing the final documents when purchasing a house. I may make the decision to do this, and now, I simply go forward. I received clearance to remain in the pattern and to take off. I knew what I was doing. Full throttle until flying speed, gentle back pressure, attain rate of climb, turn to the crosswind leg and continue climb, turn to the downwind at pattern altitude, and then turn onto the base leg. All was textbook until I turned final. I had waited too long to establish the glide and was way too high. I was not yet proficient in the ways to dump altitude, such as side slips and the judicious use of wing flaps. The only thing I could do was what that voice from the right seat was telling me: request permission to go around. So I radioed the tower for the clearance, which was the controller confirmed. It did cross my mind that it would be pretty embarrassing if I could not get the airplane down. But around I went, and on this approach, I nailed it. It wasn't until I was taxiing back to the control tower to pick up Jim that I was aware of the sweat and of the tremor in my hands. When he got in the plane, he did not comment on the solo. He very matter-of-factly said, "We're going to do some more touch and goes." After we finished the lesson, tied down the airplane, and completed the paperwork, Jim announced to 2 or 3 people in the office that I had soloed. Cheers. But no one attempted to cut a piece out of my shirt tail, which, I understood, was a time-honored tradition for student pilots when they complete their first solo. Over coffee at the little coffee shop on the airport, Jim asked me whether I had heard his voice coming from the right seat. I thought fleetingly of denying it and not giving him that satisfaction. After all, he had not commented on my solo at all. But then I admitted that I had heard his voice when I missed the approach. He told me he had been up in the control tower the whole time, just in case. Then he signed my logbook and wrote, "Most perfect solo I've ever seen." Quite honestly, I took that with a grain of salt, but it felt really good. I have one more piece which takes you to a couple years later, and you'll hear a very different tone.
I have to get my breath. I've been not breathing. Take us.
This is called expanding horizon. I learned when I started flying in October 1961 that the FAA requirement for obtaining a private pilot rating was a minimum of 40 hours of flight time, divided among dual instruction hours, solo hours, cross-country flights, a certain number of hours, quote, under the hood, close quote, i.e. flying with reference only to the flight instruments, and night flying. I had completed these requirements and then some by the end of the year, logging just over 55 hours. In retrospect, I am puzzled that I did not press Jim when he thought I would be ready for the final step in the process, a check ride with an FAA certified examiner. I don't recall even thinking about it. I believe I was so dependent on Jim, his approval, and his involvement in my achievement that I could not separate my flying from his role in it. That began to change as I became acquainted with other women pilots around the airport. With their encouragement, I joined the Los Angeles chapter of the 99s Incorporated, which is the International Organization of Women Pilots. This was the organization founded by Amelia Earhart and the 98 other certified women pilots in the United States at that time. As a member of the 99s, I learned that there were women pilots who, as student pilots, couldn't wait to complete all the requirements for the proficiency check and thus be free to fly when, where, and with whom they wanted to fly. For these women, being a student pilot was just a necessary stepstone to independence at a phase to be completed as soon as possible, not a condition to prolong. And for quite a number of 99s in the Los Angeles chapter, it was the first step toward flying in the Powder Puff Derby. The 99s is the organization that sponsored the annual All-Women Transcontinental Air Race, or AUTAR, popularly known as the Powder Puff Derby. I felt great admiration for the women who flew in the race, their stories about it, and the strong camaraderie obvious among them. It took no more than one or two of the monthly meetings of the group for me to think that maybe I could fly in the Powder Puff. 56 years after these events, I am seeing how the confluence of many vectors in my life came together around this desire to fly in the air race. I was experiencing the pain of unbridled sexist discrimination in my graduate program at UCLA. I was falling in love with my future husband. I was not aware of the importance of Jim's approval, but was very dependent on it. The situation in graduate school was not new. Before I took up flying, my coping strategy included hours and hours of psychotherapy, which in retrospect was crucial far beyond the immediate challenges of the way I was treated in the halls of academia. I did not trust the social milieu offered at the university. I was living quite contentedly alone in an apartment on a bus line to campus and was happy and relieved not to be dating at all. A dear friend I had met and became close to as a result of our being in group therapy together introduced me to my future husband, Murray. We double dated at first, but it wasn't long before I began feeling this is the one. The relevance to my flying is that he wanted to learn to fly and began instruction with Jim. When I started talking about flying the Powder Puff Derby someday, he was full of enthusiasm for my seeing whether we could make it happen. My life seemed to move forward along parallel tracks, with Maury acting as the integrator. He was crucial to my success in graduate school and my willingness to stick with it. He was a marvelous foil to the sexism rampant on campus, although I'm not sure he even understood its ramifications. I was thrilled that he took up flying and that he had decided to have Jim as his instructor. The more time he accumulated, i.e. the more money he spent on aircraft rental and instruction time, the more he began to wonder whether we should buy an airplane. His eagerness for us to be able to fly together made me realize it was high time I finished and took the FAA check ride. Meanwhile, Jim left Santa Monica Flyers and was hired on by a flight school on the Van Nuys, California airport. The scuttlebutt was that Santa Monica Flyers fired him, which both Maury and I thought was likely. However, neither one of us had any desire to question Jim about it. We just began flying with him at Van Nuys in February of 1962, continuing where we each left off. I told Jim I wanted to schedule my check ride, and he agreed I was ready. There was an FAA office on the Van Nuys airport, so I made an appointment for March 23rd and spent the intervening weeks on practice check rides with Jim. March weather in the Los Angeles basin often includes relatively strong Santa Ana winds. Sure enough, On March 23rd, we had about 8 to 10 knots of crosswind over the runway. I was not worried because I'd flown with Jim in crosswind conditions and was confident of controlling the aircraft on takeoff and landing, as well as being able to make in-flight adjustments to stay on a predetermined heading. Before we started, the examiner asked me whether I thought I could manage the conditions. Of course, I said yes. I held the correction necessary to stay straight on the runway for a takeoff roll. As we lifted off, it was necessary to crab into the wind to hold the course straight out from the runway. The examiner had his hands ready to seize control, which did nothing for my confidence. Once safely airborne and climbing out, he directed me to one of the practice areas used by student pilots for practicing in-flight maneuvers. I climbed to the altitude he asked for, leveled off, and then just followed his directions. Slow flight with and without flaps, steep turns with and without flaps, rolling out on the heading he gave me with minimal altitude change, which did not go as well as I wished. So then he asked me for 720-degree turns while holding altitude, which again was not terrific. By this time, I was convinced he was looking for maneuvers that I would not be able to complete up to textbook standards. The next maneuver he asked for was turns around a pylon. Basically, that involved finding a feature on the ground, standpipe, water tank, whatever, that functioned as a pylon, then executing a 360-degree turn around it while holding altitude and equal distance from the pylon as I flew the circle around it. This is not too hard without wind, but difficult for me to do in an aircraft as light as the Cessna 150, which has just a 100 horsepower engine. My performance throughout the whole maneuver felt pretty pathetic to me. Then he directed me to gain altitude up to 7,000 feet. I was instructed to put on the hood and fly on instruments, following his instructions, then take off the hood and head back to the airport. I remember to check for other aircraft in the area by making clearing turns before picking up a heading to the airport. Jim had taught me not to waste time losing altitude, so I left some power on and started into Van Nuys Airport. I called the tower and gained my position and received instructions for entering the pattern, as well as the crosswind advisory. Well before we entered the pattern, the FAA examiner said, "My airplane." Well, I thought, if he doesn't trust me to make the landing, and given the lack of precision in maneuvers, I guess I'll have to try again. We landed, taxied back to the tie-down area, exited the plane, and secured it. The examiner asked for my logbook and signed me off. He said not a spare word, nothing about what I did well or not, just sign me off. Oh, and he reminded me to stop by his office to pick up the form with his signature that I needed to add to the other documents to be sent to the FAA in order to receive my private pilot certificate. Jim was talking to another student when I went into the flight school office. He did not look at me, but finished his conversation. When he finally walked over to me, I couldn't help myself. I blurted out, "I made it."
Oh my, oh, Ann, I can finally take a breath. It was with you all the way. Thank you so much, Ann. That was a gift,
Fun
a
to
treat.
share. Fun to share.
Okay, and thank you for joining us again tonight, and see you next time for Writers Read. Bye-bye.